Okay, so as you know that we have already learned to create the activities relationship in our previous lesson, and also we are aware of the procedure to schedule the project activities using the schedule icon in the tools toolbar in the top of the Primavera P6 main screen. Now let's discuss another very important concept, which is called constraint. So what do you mean by constraint? Generally, the constraint means that it's an action that limits or restricts an activity or a behavior. In other words, when we apply constraint on a certain project activity, that means we impose a certain factor which affects that when an activity can start and or when an activity can be finished. So that means a constraint is a restriction or boundary on the start date or the finish date of an activity in the schedule. Thus, in Oracle Primavera P6, the constraints are used to manipulate the start or finish date of the individual activities in a certain project schedule. So we have two types of constraint in the Oracle Primavera P6. We have activity constraints, and please note that we have two types of activity constraints that can be applied on a certain project activity, which are primary constraint and secondary constraint. Then we have project constraint, which is called as must finish by date, that is normally applied on the overall project finish date. Now let's discuss the activity constraints and the project constraint one by one. As you know that we use constraints whenever we want a certain project activity to must start or must finish on a specific date. Also, it's very important to remember that sometimes in your project, the network logic alone cannot reflect all the project situations. I mean, as a project scheduler, you may come across a situation. Let's say you prepared your project schedule and you send it to your project manager for approval. Your project manager call you back and ask you to complete a certain project activity on a specific date instead of dates determined by the Primavera P6 algorithm, since she wanted to have a more tighter schedule. For example, let's see here for this activity called excavation, the start date of this activity is on 25th of October, but your project manager wanted to start it 1 week before, I mean on 19th of October. So what you will do in this case, please note that you will apply date constraint to the project activity in question. And that's what we are going to learn in our present discussion. Please always remember that Primavera P6 software uses the date constraints only when you want to create a tighter schedule. Remember what I said earlier, that constraint is a restriction on the start or the finish date of a certain project activity in the schedule. So the constraints are used to manipulate the start or the finish date of individual activities in a certain project schedule. Now, if you want to apply constraint on specific dates to a certain project activity, let's see here in the detailed form below. We can assign the primary and the secondary constraints to the activities in the status tab. Let me click on status tab, and you see here we have constraints section there in the middle of the status tab down below. So there are two types of constraints that can be assigned to a certain project activity in Oracle Primavera P6. We have primary constraint and we have secondary constraints. If you want to assign a constraint to a certain project activity, we can use this drop-down menu to assign the constraint, and for the constraint date, we can use this browse button to assign the date as needed. And similar fashion, we can assign the secondary constraint as required. So we are going to see the different types of options that are available under primary constraint in the drop-down menu, and the different options that are available in the secondary constraint as well. In the primary constraint, if I click on this drop-down menu, I will see here the different options available that are none, as late as possible, finish on or after, finish on or before, mandatory finish, mandatory start, start on or after, and start on or before. In fact, we'll go through all these options one by one and we'll try to understand that what exactly these options stands for. Please note that all the activities in the Oracle Primavera P6 are by default set to none as its primary constraint. That means an activity by default is scheduled to occur as soon as possible and does not have a constraint set. Then comes the as late as possible. That means if we set the primary constraint of a certain activity to as late as possible, it imposes a restriction on an activity with the positive float to allow it to start as late as possible without delaying its successors. And when the schedule is calculated by the Oracle Primavera P6, the Oracle Primavera P6 will set the activity early start date as late as possible without affecting the successor activities. In other words, as late as possible option, when we set a certain activity primary constraint as late as possible, that means we call this as a zero free float as well. An activity will be scheduled to occur as late as possible and it consumes free float only and does not have any particular constraint date set. Now, in order to understand these constraint types better, let's divide these constraint types into two groups, which can be open-ended constraints and the closed-ended constraint types. As you see here, the closed-ended constraints are finish on, mandatory finish, mandatory start, and start on. Similarly, the open-ended constraints are finish on or after, finish on or before, and start on or after, and start on or before. Please note that the finish on, it is also known as a must finish on constraint type, and this constraint sets a date on which the activity will finish and therefore has no float. Similarly, start on, it is also called must start on constraint type, and this constraint sets a date on which the activity will start. Therefore, the activity has no float. It has zero float. Similarly, the mandatory finish and mandatory start constraint types are part of the closed-ended constraint type. And please note that these are also called as a hard constraint type as well. So that means the closed-ended constraint types tend to must start or finish on a certain date. But if you look at the open-ended constraint types, these are finish on or after, finish on or before, but when exactly these should finish. Similarly, start on or after, start on or before, so when exactly it should start on. So that's where the role of secondary constraint comes in. In fact, the role of secondary constraint type, what it does is it helps us to define or determine these open-ended constraints. So we may say that the secondary constraints are helping us to determine the exact duration or the date for these open-ended constraints. Another important point to remember here that immediately after you assign constraint to a project activity, you will see the asterisk sign. It will appear in the start or the finish date of the particular activity, depending upon the type of constraint assigned, whether it is start constraint or it's a finish constraint. Now, in order to understand the application of constraints to a certain project activity in a better way, let's take an example. For example, let's say your project manager called you back and he said that you want to start the activity called excavation on 25th of October or after. Now, it is very clear that the activity is going to start on 25th of October, but we need to decide, or we need to find what is that after. Now here, under the drop-down menu, in the primary constraint, I will select start on or after, while my activity called excavation is selected already. Okay, now then, in order to define or find out that after, I will select under secondary constraint start on or before, and I will click on browse button in the date field and select the 31st of October. Now it is clear that our activity in question, that is excavation, it is going to start on 25th of October, but not later than the 31st of October. So this is how we can assign a open-ended constraint to a certain project activity as needed. Now let's take an example of closed-ended constraint. Let's say the requirement comes from the project manager that he wants to finish the activity called install underground water lines on 3rd of December. And in order to constrain this activity, in the status tab, I will go to the constraint area, and in the primary field, I will click on this drop down menu or drop down button and will select finish on. And you see, immediately after I select the finish on primary constraint, you will see the asterisk sign is appearing in the finish date field. And another important point, you see, you don't see the secondary constraint enabled in the secondary constraint area. It is grayed out completely. You cannot select. That means for closed-ended constraints, you don't have the option to select the secondary constraint. Let's say, for example, if you select start on, you see again the secondary constraint is grayed out. Even if I select mandatory finish, the same thing happens. And the same for the mandatory start constraint type, you see the secondary constraint is not enabled anymore. And this is how we can assign the closed-ended constraint to a certain project activity as required. So up to this point, we have learned the procedure to add the primary constraint and the secondary constraint by using the status tab in the activity detailed form as needed. Also, please note that we can assign and display the primary and secondary constraints by using the activity table as well. For example, in the layer toolbar, if I click on columns and here I will click on available options, then I will select find, or alternatively I can press Ctrl+F key on my keyboard. Now in the find what field, I will type constraint. Okay, then I will click on find next. I will just close this find window and let me expand the columns a little bit so that I can see the available options clearly. So you see, I have the primary constraint and the secondary constraint date fields are there. I will add the primary constraint date, then I will click on secondary constraint date in the available options and I will click on add to the list button. Okay, so both columns called primary constraint and secondary constraint date are added after the activity ID. Now let me search again and find out the primary constraint and the secondary constraint columns. I will click on find. Okay, since constraint is already typed under find what field, so I will click on find next. So you see, I have the primary constraint now. I will click add to the list and click on find next again. Now the next option it has selected is the secondary constraint. I will click on add to the list button. Let me close this find window. So now here under selected option, let me arrange the fields or the columns a little bit. I want the primary constraint to be displayed before the activity ID. Similarly, the secondary constraint, I want it after the primary constraint. Now it looks better. I have the activity ID, primary constraint, secondary constraint, primary constraint date, and the secondary constraint date. Let me move the activity name after the activity ID. Let me click on the move up in the list button to move the activity name field after the activity ID. Now it looks okay. I will click on OK button now. And as you can see here, I have the activity ID, activity name, and the primary constraint and the secondary constraint columns are displayed there. Now you see we have assigned constraints for the activity called excavation, okay, which are displayed under the primary constraint. The secondary constraint is start on or before. The primary constraint date and the secondary constraint date are displaying here in the activity table. Similarly, we have also assigned the constraint to the second activity, which is install underground water lines. We have mandatory start constraint applied to this activity, and the primary constraint we have set is 3rd of December. Now, please note that we can modify by double-clicking on any field as needed. Similarly, I can modify the primary or the secondary constraint if required. And remember that we have assigned the closed-ended constraint for the install underground water lines activity. So we cannot assign the secondary constraint. Even if I click on the field under the secondary constraint column, I can't do anything here. It is disabled. But of course, I can change the date and the primary constraint as needed. So this is how we can assign the primary and secondary constraint, and also can display the constraints in the activity table or in the activity view as needed. So up to this point, we have already learned to assign the primary constraint and the secondary constraint to a certain activity by using the status tab in the activity detailed form below. And the similar task can be achieved. We can display the primary constraint, secondary constraint, as well as the primary constraint date and the secondary constraint date in the activities table view. And we can also modify primary and the secondary constraints as needed here in the activity table view. And of course, you can decide your own constraint type for your project activities as per the specific requirements in the project, whether it's a start or finish constraint. Whether it's start on, finish on, mandatory start, mandatory finish, start on or after, or finish on or after, etc. Now let's move to our next very important topic called project constraint. It's important to note that the project constraint affects the overall project finish date, and we can apply this type of constraint by using the dates tab in the projects window, and further by mentioning and restricting our project finish date using the must finish by option in the dates tab in the project detail form. Now, in order to set the project constraint, we have to be in the projects window. There are multiple ways by using which we can access the projects window. We can click on projects icon in the enterprise toolbar. And second way is we can access the projects window by clicking on enterprise from the top and can select the projects option here. Now the third way is you can access the projects window by clicking on the projects tab in the active window title bar. And this is what I have done. Now you see here down we have journal, dates and notebook tabs there. But I'm interested in the dates tab, so I will click on dates tab here. And here in the project details form in the dates tab, we have the field called must finish by date. So once I click on the browse button in the must finish by option, the window is popping up where we can select the required must finish by date as needed. Now, if you can observe here, our original project finish date is 30th of August. But recently we have received a requirement from the senior management that they want us to finish our project 1 week earlier than the original planned finish date. So we'll put the project constraint and set our must finish by date to 23rd of August. So I will select 23rd and we'll click on select button here. Now you see our project must finish by date is set to 23rd of August. And by doing so, we are restricting our project to finish 1 week earlier than the original project finish date, which is 30th of August. It is very, very important to observe here that by applying the project constraint and finishing our project 1 week earlier than the original planned date, definitely it is going to affect and it has consequences on our project activities durations. And this effect can be observed by using the total float column activity table view in the activities window. Okay, so let's move back to our activities window by clicking on the activities in the activities window tab title bar. Now we need to display the total float column here, and this we can see by clicking on the columns icon in the layout toolbar. I will click here, and as you observe here under selected options, the total float is already displaying there. So I will click OK and will click here and see our total float column. Now if you can observe here in the total float column, all our critical activities are showing the 0 days float, while the non-critical activities such as erect stairwell and elevator walls, concrete basement slab, these activities have 10 days total float. By the way, if you can remember from our previous discussion, do you know what do you mean by the critical activities or critical path, and what is the total float? Please note that we have discussed these concepts in detail already in our previous lecture called Adding Activities Relationship. Please always remember that critical path is the longest path in a project schedule, and the activities on the critical path always have 0 durations. I mean, delaying any of the activities on the critical path will delay our project. And we can explain the total float as that it is the duration that an activity can be delayed without affecting the finish date of our project. Okay, so if you can remember what I said earlier, that we wanted to finish our project 1 week earlier than it was originally planned, and we have already defined the project must finish by date in the dates tab of our project detail form. So remember, our original project finish date was 30th August, but we want to finish our project on 23rd of August, 1 week earlier than the planned date. So after all these modifications, after defining the project constraint, we need to see the effect of this project constraint on our